Hey everyone, we'll just start tonight with our Welcome to Country. So we'd like to acknowledge the Awabakal people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we are today. We also acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout this beautiful nation we call home. We recognise their continuing connection to land, sea and waters, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and future. So just a few housekeeping things. If you could please keep your mics on mute. And if you have any questions, please put them in the Zoom chat or use the hashtag Yak Chats hashtag on Twitter. You can also send your questions through to Yak Media on Instagram and Facebook. Tara will be sharing these questions towards the end of the program. I'll now pass you over to Leanne so we can get started.
Hi everybody and welcome to the first Yak Chat segment. My name's Leanne. I'm the Deputy Managing Editor of Yak Media. I'm also a second year communications student at the University of Newcastle. Before we start, I'd like to thank the awesome Yak crew for helping make this event possible. A special thank you to Keely, Ryan, Tara and Alice for helping to organise and promote tonight's event. And tonight we're speaking with Professor Peter Greste. Peter is an Australian-born journalist, author and media freedom activist and academic. He is a founding member of the advocacy group Alliance for Journalist Freedoms and the UNESCO Chair in the Journalism and Communication at the University of Queensland. He is also a regular contributor to the ABC, The Australian, the Sydney Morning Herald, The Conversation and The Guardian. Peter has had an extensive career in journalism, working as a foreign correspondent. Peter has covered social and political events in Yugoslavia, Africa, Afghanistan, Latin America, the Middle East and Egypt. For his commitment to the profession and his outstanding work, Peter has received multiple prestigious awards, including a Peabody Award in 2011, a Walkie Award in 2014, and the Australian Press Council's 2018 Press Freedom Award. So there is no doubt when I say Peter has experienced situations and reported on events that we as students can only imagine. He has a keen insight into changes affecting the industry and the profession, and has been outspoken on issues facing the Australian media and journalism. It is his resilience and his passion for media freedom and social justice and objective journalism that sets him apart from many other journalists. So thank you for being here with us tonight, Peter, taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
So we'll jump right in. And I was just curious, I've spoken to you before, but I never really touched on the question of whether or not you've ever been involved in any kind of student media.
Not directly. At the university here at UQ, we don't have a student media organisation in the way that you guys would do. We don't have a student newspaper or a news website of our own. What we've been trying to do and what I've been encouraging them to do is to actively engage with other news organisations like the ABC. And we have a pitching competition where our students pitch ideas to a team of ABC, a panel of ABC producers, and the ABC chooses the best of the ideas and puts them to it. And so we've been trying to kind of work on that side of things. As you'd probably understand much better than I do, running a student media organization takes a hell of a lot of time, effort and energy and commitment.
It does.
Yeah, exactly. We've chosen to direct our energies elsewhere. But having said that, I wish in some respects that we did have it at UQ, but it's just a historical thing, I guess. And so, as I said, my contact with student media has really been through our students' interface or their work for other news organisations like the ABC.
Sure. And so now we'll take a look at the state of Australian journalism at the moment. I noticed we've moved down the ranks on the Global Press Freedom Index, down 5 points from last year. What's behind that drop in the rankings?
Oh, it's pretty straightforward. It's the impact of the AFP raids last year on News Corp and the ABC. And it's the attention really that those raids drew to the state of Australian legislation, particularly when it comes to press freedom issues. We know that, I mean, this was something that I and my colleagues at the AJF have been talking about for some time. In May last year, 3 weeks before the raids happened, we published a white paper on press freedom in Australia. And we said then that journalism in Australia had been criminalised because of a lot of the national security laws. We said that whistleblowers and journalist sources were vulnerable to prosecution. We said that journalists' notes, journalist data was exposed, was vulnerable to overbearing police investigation. We said then that the law was having a chilling effect on public interest journalism in Australia. And at the time, it all seemed like a very hypothetical complaint because we hadn't really seen these things actually work or the direct impact. Now, at the time, we still argued, and I think it's a very legitimate argument, that even though you weren't seeing journalists being locked up at the time, what we saw was still a chilling effect, that journalism and journalist sources were aware of the risks that they were taking, and so shutting down a lot of otherwise legitimate journalistic investigations. Then we had the AFP raids, and that was 3 weeks after we published, and it seemed to vindicate everything that we said in the white paper, but it also drew a lot of attention to what was happening in Australia, and that's really why we saw Australia's ranking slip in the World Press Freedom Rankings.
And so why should press freedom matter to students, and what can we as students do to help improve press freedom in Australia?
Well, you don't have to be working for News Corp or the ABC to be concerned about press freedom issues. Remember, the rankings themselves don't matter. It's just an indicator, but it shows what's going on around us. It shows what's happening in Australia.
The climate.
And yeah, the climate in Australia, exactly. And if things are not good for journalists who are working in the major news organisations, they're also not good for student journalists. And whether you're producing content now or you're planning to produce content, these laws still affect you. They're either affecting you now or they're likely to affect you. That's not to suggest, I don't think we need to be very careful not to be intimidated by this. We need to understand, one of the keys, one of the problems that we've discovered with a lot of the research that we've been doing out of UQ is that because a lot of working journalists and student journalists don't really fully understand the law, they don't really understand how far they can go before they run the risk of crossing the line and doing something illegal. And so there's a tendency to not probe those boundaries, to not sail too close. So there's a fairly wide margin of error for them. And that we're also seeing that because of the budgets that newsrooms now have, and the fact that they can't afford to pay for legal advice, for legal counsel, to discuss these kinds of issues. And of course, if you're a student journalist, that's doubly difficult. And so I think we've got a real responsibility to make sure that we understand what the law really says and what it means and how far you can go. Of course, student journalists generally can't expect it to be fully trained lawyers, but we do need to make sure that we've got a fairly solid understanding of what the law says, so that when we are involved in these kinds of stories, we really do understand when we're running the risk of getting into trouble.
Do you think that could perhaps be something that could be addressed through the education system, so through the university courses?
I think it needs to be, yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where the more you work in a particular field, the more you tend to understand, the more you kind of forced to engage with the law. When you're dealing with it as a student, it's always going to be an abstraction, because it's not something that you have to actually sit down and work out in practical terms until you're doing those kinds of stories.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that I don't think that absolves students of the responsibility and the need to understand it. Of course, and I want to emphasize, if you're planning on only working in say sport journalism or fashion or music or other areas of journalism that don't take you in government, then you've probably got a lot less to worry about. You still need to be concerned about things like defamation law, of course. In Australia, defamation law is an absolute nightmare, which is why we have a fairly substantial a program of reform around defamation law. And that's something that I think you can come a cropper on just about any story.
Yeah.
And so it's really important that we understand defamation law. And I think that by the way, is also a part of the legal landscape that is pushing our rankings down. Defamation law is a press freedom issue.
Yeah.
Very much a press freedom issue. And so journalism students really do need to understand that. But outside of defamation law, a lot of the more obscure national security legislation, you probably don't need to worry too much about if you're never planning on going there. But having said that, just by dint of being a journalist means that whether we plan on it or not, we are still going to find ourselves having to engage with governments, speaking to sources within government. If you're dealing, as I said, with music industry, they're still likely from time to time that you'll find yourself, I don't know, doing a report on government regulations around
Yep.
music festivals, for example. And we know that stories about pill testing, for example, are the kinds of stories where you see that connection between the music industry and government and the security services.
Yep.
And so if you start to go down those routes, you can find yourself coming up against these kinds of laws. So even though conceptually you might imagine that you're probably not going to need to go there, I promise you at some point in your career, the chances are that you will.
And just off the top of my head, with the changes to the fees in university degrees, a lot of that will be affecting the media industry in Australia. How do you think that will affect the future landscape of Australian media and journalism?
Gosh, you're talking about the increase in humanities degrees.
Yeah.
Well, it's a really good question. I can't honestly say that I've thought it through particularly deeply, which is probably a bit of an embarrassing admission. I think I've probably been avoiding the issue like a lot of people. I suspect it'll have two effects. The first, and one that I hope it won't do, is depress the numbers of students that are coming. We'll see how that works. I think that and one of the things that we hope is that the numbers are relatively inelastic, that students will still feel that if they're committed to a particular career path, they'll keep going with it.
Yeah.
But post degrees, I think what that does is place a lot of pressure on students to get jobs that are actually paying the kind of wages that'll help them repay student loans. And I think that's likely to have all sorts of distortions on the industry itself. One of the problems that I think our industry has, particularly in the digital revolution, is obviously the depressing effect it's had on wages, but also the increased sensitivity of journalists to the commercial viability of their stories, the attention that each story gets. In the old pre-digital world where most of us earned income from, or most of the news organizations earned income from classified advertising or from other, the classic rivers of gold. The newsroom was separate from the source of revenue, from the advertising department, and there was a great wall of China between those two, of course. And I'm not telling you guys anything that you don't already know, but my point is that if at the moment journalists are obviously much more sensitive to the commercial or the audience engagement with their stories,
Yeah.
because that obviously more engagement means more revenue, and often there are bonuses associated with that. And so what I hope we won't see, but what I think there is likely to be, is an increased pressure to make stories that generate clicks.
Yeah.
And of course, we know that clickbait isn't necessarily the same as good journalism.
Definitely true.
That's sort of thinking things through perhaps a little bit more deeply than, because that's gazing into a crystal ball, I think, probably beyond the capacity of the ball to actually see anything reasonable. I mean, there's also a lot that's going to happen, I think, in the industry in the next 2 or 3 years. You know, remember we've got the ACCC inquiry, and there's a lot of talk now about whether or not Google and Facebook will end up having to pay for Australian news content, and that may or may not be a good thing. Personally, I don't think it's a great idea.
Okay.
But you know, we'll just have to wait and see how that unfolds. I think that there are, and we can have another conversation about that. No need to go into that now. But my point is that there is a lot of change. There's a lot of debate. We know that, and I think if you go to the core of what's driving that ACCC inquiry, it's a recognition by government and by the industry that the current system is broken, that we need to find some new way of re-engineering the news business to get income back into newsrooms and to help support and pay for good independent journalism, good public interest journalism. And the fact that that conversation is happening at all, even if I disagree with the solution, at least the solution they've come up with now, the fact that that conversation is happening, I think, is a really important shift in consciousness of government.
Definitely.
And so what it means is that the fundamentals of the industry are changing. The earth is shifting. How far it will shift, what we will see out the other side, I think is too difficult to predict at this point. But what we are dealing with now is not the kind of media environment that our students will be entering when most of them in the next 2 or 3 years will find when they get out into the workforce. And I'm reasonably confident that because the conversation is taking place, the environment that students will be entering will be much better than it is at the moment. I just can't say how that is going to look. That's the big unknown.
Yeah. And so since studying my degree of communication, which majors in journalism, I've learned a lot of different things from the theoretical to the practical side of things. But obviously when I enter the workforce, putting all of that into play is going to be a whole other ball game. So what can students expect when they enter the workforce as a journalist or media professional, and what are some of the do's and don'ts that we should be aware of?
You know, it's a really difficult thing for me to say what they can expect, simply because, you know, what a student can expect when they're going into ABC or SBS is very different to what they can expect if they're going into the Murrumbidgee Irrigator. You know, they're very different environments, and you know, so I think it's difficult for me to generalize and to speculate about what that would look like too, particularly given what I've just mentioned about how I think things will change quite radically. But the one thing, I guess, if there is a piece of advice that I've got, it's to hold your ethical line. Because I think fundamentally there is always going to be a lot of pressure to go commercial, to change, or to be a bit, to err on to go tabloid, to prioritize speed over accuracy, to prioritize polemic over serious analysis. And I think that fundamentally, to maintain your credibility and authority as a journalist, you need to hold on to the kind of ethics that I hope you're being taught. Those really key ethics and principles that underpin good journalism. Because if you can hold that line, then whatever emerges, you will hold your credibility. It's a really key thing. It's almost, I think of it as an investment in your future and your reputation. And that's the thing. Maintain that commitment to standards, to accuracy, to integrity, to balance, to fairness. And if you can do that, then I think you're in a very good place.
Excellent advice. And so you started off your career as a freelancer, is that right?
Not quite. I started my career I started off in regional television in Shepparton, in northeast Victoria.
Okay.
And I went to Darwin, where I worked for a freelance production company working on the 10 network. And then I went to Adelaide for a few years in the Channel 10. But my career as a foreign correspondent began as a freelance.
Okay.
It was when the 10 network went into receivership and they shut the London bureau down to save money. And I thought then, well, it's ridiculous. You can't have one of the main Australian commercial TV networks without a London correspondent. I marched into my old boss's office and said, look, if I go and work freelance, will you hire me? And he said, sure, why not? And it didn't cost them anything. And they knew who I was. And so I marched off and started doing some work for the 10 network. And I did very little work for Channel 10. I did a whole lot of work for all sorts of other news organizations, but it was just the kind of incentive that I needed to get me out there.
Sure. And so freelancing is something that's obviously an appealing option for people studying communications and media, and even in the creative industries these days. So is there any advice you can give to students who are thinking about starting off as a freelancer?
Yeah, there are a few things I'd say. The first is to back yourself. And by that, I also mean invest in yourself, be prepared to take a hit.
Mm-hmm.
So in my case, I went off and the first trip that I did was to Yugoslavia during the war. And I wouldn't recommend that students follow that particular path. But the thing is, and the reason I'm telling this story is that I knew it was going to cost me money. What I did was that I had a story that I found that was in Yugoslavia. And I approached the Australian and the ABC and said, listen, I've got this yarn. You don't have to commission it from me. You don't have to buy it from me. But if I can get it and write it, is it the kind of story that you would run? And so there was no commitment from them. I wasn't asking them to pony up. What I was simply saying is, listen, I'm here. I have this idea. I have a story that I'm going to do. Is it something that you're interested in? And they said, yep, absolutely. And by the way, if you've got any other ideas, then please let us know. And so I went to Yugoslavia, and as I said, it cost me an arm and a leg, and I knew it was going to cost me. But it established a relationship with the Australian and the ABC. Mm-hmm. And they got to know my work, they got to know what I was capable of doing. And about a year later, when this was back in 1993, 94, when there was elections, the post-apartheid elections in South Africa, I called up my contacts at the ABC and the Australian. I said, listen, I'm going to take myself to South Africa. Would you be interested in freelance stories from there? And they said, hell yes. And so I went off again with those contacts. Now, again, I didn't make much money. In fact, I broke even, but I paid for my trip around South Africa, and I paid for the adventure. I got enough income to pay for the chance to be a part of that really historic epoch-making period of South Africa's history, the end of apartheid, the election of Nelson Mandela. And then a short time after that, when I got back from that trip, I was looking for ways of getting into the BBC. I've been doing a little bit of freelance production work for the BBC, but World Service, they didn't know who I was. And so I thought, well, look, what I'll do is that I'll apply for a job with the BBC. The job wasn't important. I knew I wasn't going to get the job, but I wanted to apply for it anyway and make sure that BBC managers would have a chance, would be forced to see my CV. Mm-hmm. When I didn't get the job, I'd then say, look, thanks for the opportunity for applying, but by the way, I'm also in the market for freelance work. Have you got anything? I was going to do freelance shift work over there. And then once I knew and understood how the BBC operated, had a relationship, I was then going to go off and open up start working freelance in an undercovered part of the world. That was my big grand strategy. Well, the first job that came up was the Kabul correspondence job. And I remember when I was researching it thinking, holy shit, thank God I'm not going to get this job because it's suicide. I applied for it, and blow me down, they gave me the job. And they gave me the job because on the strength of the work that I'd already done in Yugoslavia and South Africa. Yeah. And so again, the whole point of that story is to say, you need to have the confidence to take yourself off to produce stories, to produce content.
Mm-hmm.
Not that you should produce it for free, but that you need to approach news organizations with ideas.
Yep.
And say, you know, I have to pay from up front. Once I establish a relationship, once you know who I am, what I can do, then we can talk about commissioning and expenses and so on. But let me at least show what I can do with a good yarn.
Yeah.
And once you've got that relationship going, once they know who you are, they recognize your name, once you're a known quantity, that's when things start to develop. But you need to be prepared to invest in yourself, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Put yourself out there.
Put yourself out there, yeah.
Yep.
And it can be tough, by the way. I know, particularly for students. Believe me, I'm not diminishing this, but make sure you have a go. And there is one other thing that I want to mention. While I'm thinking of this, there is a tendency for all freelancers, and I still do it, to self-edit, to over-edit, to come up with a story idea, one moment, think that's a fantastic idea, and then 15 minutes later, talk yourself out of it, think, no, it's shit, no one's going to buy that, it's rubbish. And even now, I still do that. It's doubly easy if you're a student. And so what I would say is every time you have an idea, jot it down. Once you've got a file of ideas, run them past a friend. Run them past somebody else, another freelance, another journalist, or better yet, run them past a commissioning editor in a newspaper or news organization that you're thinking of doing. Because I promise you, half of the stuff that you think is rubbish probably won't be rubbish. But you'll never know until you run it past these guys. And often they will say, well, that kind of works, but why don't you change it and take it from this particular angle?
Yep.
We did something like that a week ago, so thanks but no thanks, but we still think that's a good idea. But you will never know until you start throwing in ideas. Just keep those ideas flowing, keep pestering the commissioning editors, and eventually you'll land on something. You'll start to develop a sense of the kinds of ideas that they're interested in, and then you'll get a bite.
And so lastly, I'd like to touch on we're living in really uncertain and challenging times, obviously. But even before the pandemic, the media industry and journalism in particular was in a state of crisis. So this is a question I think many students will be asking themselves. What do you think the future of Australian media and communications industry will look like? And what do you think the main challenges we face moving forward from where we are now?
Well, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about business models and how that kind of moving landscape is going to land, how that's going to look like. I don't know. I don't pretend to know. Just when I think I've got a sense of how it's going to look, it shifts. But there are a couple of things I would say. First of all, we need to remember that journalists are part of the world's second oldest profession. The oldest, of course, is prostitution. I'm not suggesting that we go there, but the second oldest profession is storytellers. You know, as long as humans have been able to talk, as long as humans have been able to scrawl, streak bits of mud across the walls of caves, we've had storytellers. We've had people whose job it is to relay news of what's taking place in the world, to make sense of the stories that are unfolding in the world around us. And so in some form or other, we will always need those people.
Yep.
And so journalism will exist. You just need to be flexible enough to adapt to whatever form that journalism eventually evolves into. We are in a state of transition. It's very difficult to predict how it will unfold, but you need to be flexible enough and resilient enough to recognize that it will be necessary, and we are going to figure out a way of making sure that storytellers, good journalists, are well paid. And that means being creative. That means exercising your creative muscles. Students are the best ones for that kind of thing. You know, you're the guys that really don't know the boundaries, don't know what can't be done. And if you don't know what can't be done, you tend to try things the rest of us think can't be done and end up doing it anyway. And I think that's something really to hold on to nurture and cherish.
Yep.
You know, to sort of hold on to that sense of adventure and that passion. Because ultimately, you know, let me get you into a secret. I became a journalist partly because I still connected with the higher ideals of holding the powerful to account and so on, and being, you know, doing the first draft of history and all that kind of stuff. And that's really important. Believe me, I get that. But ultimately, the main reason why I became a journalist was because it was a license to indulge my curiosity, a license to go off and have adventures. Sometimes you need to be careful what you wish for. Kind of worked a little bit better than I anticipated.
The adventures.
Yeah, the adventures did. But that's still what drives me with this. That's still the thing that I think it makes it, you know, one of the best jobs on earth.
And so you've obviously had a lot of challenging experiences in your career. How have you maintained your resilience? How have you kept going? You seem very optimistic about the future of journalism and everything. How do you kind of maintain that resilience, Peter?
Because I think it's a really good question. It's a big question. It's a difficult one to answer in the space of a few sentences. Fundamentally, I haven't taken things personally. If there have been setbacks, and it's not an easy thing to do. We tend to take things personally. We tend to assume that if something isn't working out, it's because we're not trying hard enough. Mm-hmm. Often, of course, that's not to say that you should sit on your ass and not work hard and blame everybody else for your own failures. But I've also recognized that a lot of the problems, a lot of the challenges, a lot of the reasons that you need to tap into those resources of resilience haven't been about me. It's been about the kind of situation that you encounter. And so there was a fantastic book I read when I was in prison called Man's Search for Meaning by a guy called Viktor Frankl. I don't really believe in a lot of the kind of self-help books or self-improvement books, but Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, is quite special. It's an amazing book, and I'd recommend anybody to read it. It's also a fairly short book, but Frankl was a survivor of Auschwitz. In fact, a survivor of 3 of the extermination camps, and tried to understand what it was that helped people survive the camps. Obviously, there was a degree of randomness, but of those who made it through, what was it that set them apart? And he said it wasn't really physical strength. He said it was inverting the kind of usual question that we ask ourselves about the meaning of life. And he said, it's really about saying that how do we answer the questions that life asks of us? And that's the key. It's how you respond to the kinds of circumstances that you're faced with. So you shouldn't always take responsibility for setbacks, but you do take responsibility for your response to those setbacks. And that's the key. I'm not to blame for what happened to us in Egypt. It wasn't about me. It wasn't about anything that we did. But I am responsible for how I responded to that. And that's an understanding that where your capacity where your control lies and and what's outside of your control is really key. There's another great quote from Alcoholics Anonymous. Not that I've been an alcoholic, but I know that they have what they call the Serenity Prayer, which says, Lord, give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And in the Serenity Prayer, you realize that when you think about it, the tough thing is the last part of that, the wisdom to know the difference between what you do have the power to change and what is beyond your control.
Yeah.
Once you understand that, then resilience kicks into play, because you know what you can do.
Know your boundaries and your
Know your
capabilities.
boundaries. Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's often, I know this is diving into the realms of big kind of philosophy, but the issue of resilience is not just about journalism. It is really also about philosophy, about your approach to life in general.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, that was the last of my questions for tonight. So thank you for spending some time with us. For those of you in the chat, if you haven't accessed Peter's books yet, I suggest you do. Freeing Peter was a book that was written about the campaign to free Peter from the Egyptian prison in 2013. Also, the First Casualty, a memoir from the front lines of the global war on journalism. We'll be making those links to those books that are available online, available in the show notes. So now we'll start with the Q&A part of tonight. And so I'll pass you over to Tara. Thank you, Peter.
Pleasure.
Hi, Peter. Thank you so much. You've provided some amazing advice and shared some really interesting stories. You're very inspiring, and I'm so glad we got a chance to talk to you this evening.
It's a pleasure. No, thanks for the chance to talk to you guys. We've
got a fair few questions from our audience across social media. I will start with one from Carlos. He's posted in the chat. He said, can a journalist be an activist? He provides some context with this, and he says, Tim Davie, the new BBC boss, said, if you want to be an opinionated columnist or a partisan campaigner on social media, then that is a valid choice, but you should not be working at the BBC. What do you think about that?
So the answer to both parts of that is yes. A journalist can be an activist, but the BBC is a particular form of journalism, particularly because of the role that the BBC plays in British public life, in the same way the ABC plays here. You have to accept that you know, as a BBC employee, and I spent 15 years working for the BBC. You've got to maintain a very dry, non-partisan, non-activist line. But having said that, I think we still need to, and this is something that I don't think Tim Davie is suggesting at all, that we go for the kind of false equivalence of saying, well, you know, climate change, because climate change scientists are predicting that the globe is going to warm by a factor of 3 degrees over the next 20 or 30 years. On the other hand, there are those that say that climate science has been corrupted by special interests. You can't do that kind of false equivalence. Is something that we cannot get into. As a journalist, you have a responsibility to pass out the truth. And that doesn't mean, and sometimes that can appear to be an activist when you're dealing with contentious issues, particularly around things like climate change or vaccination science, for example. You need to avoid the kind of false equivalence. Just because somebody says the earth is flat doesn't mean that you give them equal airtime to the scientists that telling us that actually it's round. And as I said, sometimes that can look like an activist. Sometimes people will accuse you of being an activist, but ultimately that's just being a good journalist. I think that we need to understand that distinction. But that doesn't mean when you work for the BBC, for example, that you are necessarily therefore a campaigner. Things like gay marriage, for example, or abortion, contentious social issues, where there is a serious difference of opinion, and you need to reflect that difference fairly and accurately. And that's where not being a campaigner comes into play. Again, there is absolutely every reason why, if you go and work for an LGBTQ magazine, that you should then take an activist stance as a journalist. And that's fine, because that's where we know what the policy of that paper is likely to be. But it's inappropriate for an organisation like the BBC or the ABC.
Very interesting. We've got another question from Delia. What is your impression of friendly Geordies? And do you think Geordies impacts younger generations politically? Are you aware of who that is?
No.
Okay, fair enough. His name's Jordan Shanks. He is a political commentator and comedian in Australia. He mainly does his work on YouTube. So there you go, someone for you to look up maybe. We'll go to another question. So from Phoebe, she asked, do you think integrity in journalism still exists, or have our platforms become so restricted that we don't have freedoms to be unbiased?
Look, integrity, of course, absolutely still exists. You know, every news organization, even news organizations that have been accused of being quite biased or quite abandoning their integrity, still has journalists that put these down. I don't really need these. When I'm reading close, it becomes an issue. But anyway, it keeps sliding down my nose. I need to get them adjusted. So look, integrity, it's of course it still exists. And I really encourage you to hold on to your principles and ethics and integrity as a journalist, because ultimately it is what separates journalism, I think, from, and I'm not saying those who are activists don't have integrity. What I'm saying that your integrity as a journalist or your reputation as a journalist depends on your integrity and your fidelity to those higher ethical principles of good journalism. And I think that's really what Tim Davey is saying, that you need to hold on to those really core ethical principles if you're going to work for an organization like the BBC. You can set aside some of those principles of bias, if you like, and take a particular activist stance if you're not working there, but that's a different form of journalism. Just tell me again the second part of the question, because I'm...
do you, because we have so many platforms, do you feel as though we are restricted and don't have the freedom to be unbiased?
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, to be honest with you. I mean, the freedom to be unbiased. I mean, you'll know when I talk about, and I'm sure your own lecturers discussed this too, that bias is an inherent part of who we are. You know, we all have a particular view on things. We all need to recognize what that subjective position is. That's why I always talk about fairness, accuracy, and balance as the principal things that we need, the principal ethics that we need to hold on to. And as far as possible, we need to step away from it and acknowledge our own biases and counter for those biases. But you still have to make subjective choices in the journalism that you do. The idea that you have the freedom to be unbiased suggests to me that you're taking an activist stance. And again, that's fine as long as you declare that up front, as long as that's very clear that that is what you are setting out to do, that you're making an argument, that you're promoting a particular line, that you're taking a political position, or if you're taking a position in a particular story. And if that's made clear, if readers understand that's what's driving you, if you stand on a platform, if you work in a platform that encourages that or says that that's who we are, then I think that's okay. But the key is to make sure that your audience understands that you're not pretending to be a neutral journalist in the middle, that you're showing up front what it is that you're trying to achieve. That's, I think, what we need to be transparent about.
Yeah, I've got an interesting one for you. Do you believe shock jocks lack a moral compass? There's a lot of layers to this one, I feel.
There are a lot of layers there.
Oh, you've frozen, Peter. We've lost you. Hang on. Oh, yep. No, there you go.
I'm back. I'm saying I'm going to avoid the question because I think it's too general to give a safe answer to. Because I think there are some that do have, and some that don't. Also, I'd argue that there are some people who others might call shock jocks would not consider themselves to be shock jocks. They'd simply say that they're. I mean, I know Chris Kenny, for example, very well, a columnist for the Australian, and I think a lot of people would consider him. And if you look at his Twitter feed, if you look at some of his work on Sky After Dark, he takes a very strong political position on the right of politics. He says that in fact he's being a neutral. He's taking a neutral stance because the rest of the media has shifted so far to the left that they've lost sight of where the centre ground is. Chris would argue, and I think that to a certain extent he does have a moral compass. Whether that's the same compass that I have, I think that's probably questionable. But to say that he doesn't is to engage in a really difficult ethical debate. So I'm going to avoid that overly general question, I'm afraid.
That's fine. How significant was the role of Ogilvy PR in bringing you back home to Australia?
Of what PR?
Ogilvy PR.
Ogilvy.
Yeah.
So Ogilvy was hired by Al Jazeera, by the network, to help manage PR, to help manage social media, and they were really important. I won't say that they were necessarily the only thing that did it, but they were part of that really key social media campaign. We really couldn't have done it without them, although, well, maybe we could have, but it would have looked different. But they were certainly, and so I think they were really key in helping shape the kind of social media message and helping my family understand. Of course, they weren't the only people that were part of that, of the kind of team that were running the social media campaign. There were a lot of others that really did understand also how social media worked. But Ogilvy were really, really helpful in organizing, in distributing and elevating a lot of the kind of social media messages that we developed. And so in that respect, they were really crucial to it. The point is that the social media campaign was vital to getting me out of prison. If we didn't have that, then I'm convinced I would still be stuck in Egypt today. The Free AJ Stuff hashtag got something like 3 billion impressions. That's billion with a B.
Crazy.
It was absolutely nuts. I know my own family was probably responsible for half of those, but by any measure, it was a colossal social media campaign, and no politician could really ignore just how big it was. Now, there are a whole host of factors to what made that so successful. My family and my parents and their capacity to connect and engage with the media was part of that. The support that I had from my colleagues, my journalism colleagues, both here in Australia, but also all over the world, was a big part of that. But Ogilvy was undeniably a part of that overall machine.
As a PR student myself, I'm quite interested in the relationship between journalism and PR. And I was just wanting to know, what have your personal experiences been with that relationship, that dynamic between a journalist and a public relation practitioner? And what do you think of their relationship?
So I think that the journalist connection or journalist relationship with PR people, with PR folks, with media guys is to understand, first of all, that you have a particular issue that you're trying to push. But that, I think I've always considered PR people as facilitators for stories, as sources of stories, as people who can help make kinds of connections that I want. Sometimes they become managers of the story, and that's where obviously there becomes a certain tension where you're trying to block, where a lot of PR people are trying to block access to a story or protect a company from a particular story, which I often think is the wrong approach, by the way, because I think, I hope that what you're taught is that good PR people understand the need for for transparency. The best way to solve a PR crisis is to be frank and honest about it quickly, to own up to the mistakes and be clear about accepting the mistakes that have been made and addressing those mistakes. And that's really the best way to run a PR crisis campaign and a crisis management. And so when it's working well, the PR people are the ones that help direct journalists to the resources and the information that they need within a company or within a sector, within a government agency. And likewise, they're the ones who come to us with stories because they understand what we as journalists need, and the help they're able to package up the information in a way that makes it easy for journalists to get to those kinds of stories. And I think when it works really well, there's a really good symbiosis. But you need to understand how those two roles are different, that the PR person's job is to represent the company, to advocate for the company and their ideas, and to help generate attention and publicity for that company, good attention, good publicity. Whereas a journalist doesn't have that kind of particular special interest, that your job is to get to the without pushing a particular company line. And if you understand what those roles are, and you understand when those boundaries start to blur, that things become difficult.
Yes, yeah, I can understand that completely. We've received a lot of questions, mainly about what would your main advice be to young journalists, young PR practitioners, anyone entering the media industry now? What advice would you give them to get work, or how they can succeed in the workforce?
Look, it comes back to what I was saying to you earlier about freelancing. Whether you're doing it as a freelance or you're trying to get a job, what you need to do is demonstrate your capacity as a journalist. And that means backing yourself, showing potential employers what you can do. And that means taking a punt on a story, even if you're not entirely sure whether it's going to get a client or going to get bought. If you've got a story idea, and you need to keep coming up with ideas, keep generating stories. And I think that's really the key thing, is to get out and have a go. And again, by doing it, you will learn what works and what doesn't. You start to practice. You know, when you're producing a story for production, and I'm sure as anyone who works for Leanne would know, it's a very different thing to producing stories for publication on a public-facing website, or in a student news service or a real news service, than it is for producing classroom essays. And so your education doesn't stop when you leave, when you finish your degree. That's when it really starts. That's when the rubber hits the road. The other thing I would say, and this does come back to what I was saying, to my own experience, is to not be afraid to get out into the bush, into regional news, into small newsrooms, because I think that's where you learn, that's where you hone your skills. I can honestly say that the skills that I learned, or the skills that made me a good foreign correspondent, were the skills that I learned in regional newsrooms, in regional newsroom in Shepparton, because it's about the thing that a regional newsroom teaches you is how to tell stories that might seem quite small and minor, to give them meaning, how to make them relevant to people, to entire communities, to cover the local dog show and find a way of covering that dog show in a way that makes it interesting and engaging for audiences that just wouldn't otherwise care about it. It also taught me about the need for speed and accuracy, and accuracy in particular, because in a regional newsroom, you engage with the readers, with your audiences, the very next day. They bump into you into the street, they'll pull you up and say, mate, you mispronounced my cousin's son's best friend's name in that when you did the report last night. They pull you up, they show you, because you engage with them on a routine basis. You go into a story about some local business, and those people are advertising with your newspaper. They will tell you if you screwed up. It's where you get to try things out, because these are often smaller, and I won't say inconsequential, it matters if you screw up, but there is a flexibility for you to try ideas, to test new ways of doing it. Well, I once did a piece of camera hanging upside down out of a mango tree. Like I said, I once did it. Never did it again. It was an experiment. I was young. I was, having a go, but I was able to get away with it. And so, it's where you learn those really basic craft skills. You get a high turnover of stuff. You're having to do stories every single day, and often 2 or 3 stories. And I'm not saying that everyone has to get out into the regions. What I'm saying is look for opportunities in regional newsrooms. And I guess Newcastle, you guys would understand, often regional news is where it's happening. And one other thing is that even though we know that a lot of regional newsrooms are closing, there are newsrooms that are starting to open up again, that are looking to hire, that are starting to develop new business models, that a lot of local businesses are starting to recognize that they need local news for the identity of their news, of their towns, their communities, that a lot of the online platforms just don't work. They don't engage the community. They don't hold the communities together well. And so that's, in the long run, it's a really great place to develop and sharpen your skills.
That's great. I think you've given us some really great advice. I might pop you back through to Leanne and we can wrap it up from there. Thank you so much again.
So I've just got one last question before we finish, because it's personal interest to me as well. So Maya Hinton's asked in the chat, what's your opinion on Kevin Rudd's petition to the Australian government regarding Murdoch Industries?
Well, Kevin's petition isn't just about Murdoch. I'm a little bit wary about pointing the finger at Murdoch or at any one news organisation, because I think when you do that, what it does is that it makes it personal in a way that I don't think is conducive to good debate. The fundamental thing that's driving his petition is the concentration of media ownership in Australia, and that is an issue. It's not just Murdoch. The 9 papers, the 9 network, the 9 empire, if you like, is also highly concentrated. And between Murdoch and 9, and then sort of somewhere out there, the ABC, and even smaller out there with the Guardian and others, we have the most concentrated media landscape in the world, and that is not healthy. That's just not healthy. And so I think that on that basis, I really support it. But I'm a little bit wary about making it just about Murdoch, because it looks like a vendetta. And I think we know that Kevin Rudd has an issue, and I'm not going to, I think a lot of his arguments, you can see why he makes the arguments that he does. But I am concerned more specifically about the concentration of media ownership, and I do think that justifies a government inquiry.
Well, thank you very much for your time tonight, Peter. It's been awesome, and you've given us so much food for thought as students to think about once we enter the workforce. It's been a pleasure. Can I just very quickly jump in? Gemma has quickly asked, saying that she's not getting replies to her email pitches. And I understand that what you need to do is get on the damn phone. Send your email in. If you don't get a reply, send a follow-up. And if you don't get another reply to the follow-up, get on the damn phone. And don't be afraid. Again, if you are sitting there, you'll be swamped by things, and you won't always have the chance to reply. And if someone, it's much harder to ignore a phone call. And sometimes you need to be that mosquito in the room. You need to be the fly in their ears, because and I know it can be difficult. I know it can be discouraging. I know it can be really depressing and frustrating. But all I can suggest is that you can, and if they say, listen, I'm sorry, it just wasn't our thing, you can ask for some sort of guidance. And if they say, look, I'm sorry, I haven't got time, it's okay. Just put it down and leave
accept that you're not going to engage with them and go somewhere else. But just don't give up. Please don't give up.
That's it. Thank you, Peter. You have a good evening, and we might speak to you again down the track, see how Australian media is in a year's time, maybe.
Okay, it's a pleasure.
Thank
Thanks
you.
again.
Bye.
Cheers, guys.